Edward asks, "And agitators, how do they agitate?" Alex says, "By convincing the non-Christians that the slaughter of the monkeys has put a curse on them, which can only be removed by slaughtering the Christians. They have even been persuading some of the converts, who after all prefer not to be slaughtered, to relapse into being non-Christian. So instead of eating monkeys, they're eating Christians." Maybe not cannibalism, but really far more the other way around. Have, people been killed for not being Christian? To this day. Julie says, "Who have eaten monkeys?" Alex says, "The native is not, I fear, very logical." Julia says, "I wondered where you were taking us with your monkeys. I thought I was going to dine out on those monkeys. But one can't dine out on eating Christians, even among non-Christians," which probably oppose it more than the Christians en masse. You hear a cannibal. Cannibals are more likely to be Christian nowadays. But Alex says, "Not on the whole story. Edward, I'm not saying that, being Christian makes a person cannibal. It's the same as being a cannibal or anything like that." Alex says, "Not on the whole story." Edward says, "And have any of the English residents been murdered?" Alex says, "Yes, but they are not usually eaten. When these people have done with the European, he is, as a rule, no longer fit to eat." Edward says, "And what has your commission accomplished?" Alex says, "We have just drawn up an interim report." Edward says, "Will it be made public?" Alex says, "It cannot be at present. There are too many international complications. Eventually, there may be an official publication." Edward says, "But when?" Alex says, "In a year or two." Edward says, "And meanwhile?" Alex says, "Meanwhile, the monkeys multiply." Lavinia says, "And the Christians?" Alex says, "The Christians. Now I think I ought to tell you about someone are new." Julie says, "Edward, somebody must have walked over my grave. I'm feeling so chilly. Give me some gin. Not a cocktail. I'm freezing. In July." The caterer's man, "Mr. Coupe." Edward says, "Now who?" And Peter enters. "Why, it's Peter." Lavinia says, "Peter." Peter says, "Hello, everybody." Lavinia says, "When did you arrive?" Peter says, "I flew over from New York last night. I left Los Angeles 3 days ago. I saw Sheila Paisley at lunch today, and she told me you were having a party. She's coming on later, after the gunnings. So I said, I really must crash in. It's my only chance to see Edward and Lavinia. I'm only over for a week, you see, and I'm driving down to the country this evening, so I knew you wouldn't mind my looking in so early. It does seem ages since I last saw any of you. And how are you, Alex? And dear old Julia?" Lavinia says, "So you've just come from New York?" Peter says, "Yes, from New York. The Balagomskis saw me off. You remember Princess Balagomsky? In the old days, we dined the other night at the Saffron Monkey. That's the place to go now." Alex says, "How very odd. My monkeys are saffron." Peter says, "Your monkeys, Alex? I always said that Alex knew everybody, but I didn't know that he knew any monkeys." Julia says, "But give us your news. Give us your news of the world, Peter. We lead such a quiet life here in London." Peter says, "You always did enjoy a leg pull, Julia. But you all know I'm working for Pan Am Eagle." Edward says, "No, tell us, what is Pan Am Eagle?" Peter says, "You must have been living a quiet life. Don't you go to the movies?" Lavinia says, "Occasionally." Peter says, "Alex knows." "Do you see my last picture, Alex?" Alex says, "I knew about it, but I didn't see it. There's no cinema in Kanja." Peter says, "Kanja? Where is that?" "They don't have pictures? Pan Am Eagle must look into this. Perhaps it would be a good place to make one. Alex knows all about Pan Am Eagle. It was he who introduced me to the great Bella." Julia says, "And who is the great Bella?" Peter says, "Why, Bella Songadi. He's my boss." I thought everybody knew his name. Julia says, "Is he your connection in California, Alex?" Alex says, "Yes. We have sometimes obliged each other." Peter says, "Well, it was Bella sent me over just for a week, and I had my hands full. I'm going down tonight to Botwell." Julie says, "To stay with the Duke?" Peter says, "And do him a good turn. We're making a film of English life, and we want to use Boltwell." Julia says, "But I understand that Boltwell is in a very decayed condition." Peter says, "Exactly it is, and that's why we're interested. The most decayed noble mansion in England, at least of any that are still inhabited. We've got a team of experts over to study the decay, so as to reproduce it. Then we build another Boltwell in California." Julia says, "But what is your position, Peter? Have you become an expert on decaying houses?" Peter says, "Oh dear, no. I've written the script of this film, and Bella is very pleased with it. He thought I should see the original Boltwell, and besides, he thought that, as I'm English, I ought to know the best way to handle a duke. Besides that, we've got the casting director. He's looking for some typical English faces. Of course, only for minor parts, and I'll help him decide what faces are typical." Julie says, "Peter, I've thought of a wonderful idea. I've always wanted to go to California. Couldn't you persuade your casting director to take us all over? We're all very typical." He says, "No, I'm afraid." The caterer's man, Sir Henry Harcourt Riley. Julie says, "Oh, I forgot. I had another surprise for you." Riley enters. "I want you to meet Miss Sir Henry Harcourt Riley." Edward says, "We're delighted to see him, but we have met before." Julie says, "Then if you know him already, you won't be afraid of him. You know, I was afraid of him at first. He looked so forbidding." Riley says, "My dear Julia, you were giving me a bad, very bad introduction." Supposing that an introduction was necessary, Julia says, "My dear Henry, you were interrupting me." Lavinia says, "If you can interrupt Julia, Sir Henry, you're the perfect guest we've been waiting for." Riley says, "I should not dream of trying to interrupt Julia." Julia says, "But you're both interrupting." Riley says, "Who is interrupting now?" Julia says, "Well, you shouldn't interrupt my interruptions. That's really worse than interrupting. Now my head's fairly spinning. I must have a cocktail." Edward says to Riley, "And will you have a cocktail?" Riley says, "Might I have a glass of water?" Edward says, "Anything with it?" Riley says, "Nothing, thank you." Lavinia says, "May I introduce Mr. Peter Coupe, Sir Henry Harcourt Riley. Peter's an old friend of my husband and myself. Oh, I forgot." Turning to Alex, "I rather assumed that you knew each other. I don't know why I should, Mr. MacColkey Gibbs." Alex says, "Indeed, yes, we have met." Riley says, "On several commissions. Peter's just over from California, where he's something very important in films. He's making a film of English life. And he's going to find parts for all of us. Think of it. But Julia, I was just about to explain, I'm afraid I can't find parts for everyone in this film. It's not my business. And that's not the way we do it." Julia says, "But Peter, if you're taking Boltwell to California, why can't you take me?" Peter says, "We're not taking Boltwell. We reconstruct a Boltwell. Julie says, very well, and then, why not reconstruct me? It's very much cheaper. Oh dear, I can see you're determined not to have me. So goodbye to my hopes of seeing California. Peter says, you know you'd never come if we invited you. But there's someone I wanted to ask about. Who did really want to get into films? And I always thought she could make a success of it if she only got the chance. It's Celia Copplestone. She always wanted to, and now I could help her. I've already spoken to Bella about her, and I want to introduce her to our casting director. I've got an idea for another film. Can you tell me where she is? I couldn't find her in the telephone directory. Julia says, not in the directory, or in any directory. You can tell them now, Alex. What does Julia mean? Says Lavinia. Alex says, I was about to speak of her when you came in, Peter. I'm afraid you can't have Celia. Peter says, oh, is she married? Alex says, not married, but dead. Lavinia says, Celia? Alex says, dead? Peter says, dead. That knocks the bottom out of it. Edward, Celia dead? Julie says, you'd better tell them, Alex, the news that you bring back from Kinkunja. Lavinia says, Kinkunja? What was Celia doing in Kinkunja? We heard that she had joined some nursing order. Alex says, she had joined an order, a very austere one, and she's already had an experience. As she already had experience of nursing. Lavinia says, yes, she had a VAD, I remember. Not sure what that stands for. Alex was directed to Kinkunja, where there are various endemic diseases, besides, of course, those brought by Europeans, and where the conditions are favorable to plague. Edward says, go on. Alex says, it seems that there were 3 of them, 3 sisters at this station in a Christian village, and half the natives were dying of pestilence. They must have been overworked for weeks. Edward says, and then? Alex says, and then the insurrection broke out among the non-Christians, of which I was telling you. They knew of it, but would not leave the dying natives. Eventually 2 of them escaped. One died in the jungle, and the other will never be fit for normal life again. But Celia Copplestone, she was taken. When our people got there, they questioned the villagers, those who survived, and then they found her body, or at least they found the traces of it. Edward says, but before that, Alex says, it was difficult to tell, but from what we know of local practices, it would seem that she must have been crucified very near an anthill. Yeah, the Romans weren't the only people to crucify. Lavinia says, but Celia, of all people, Edward says, and just for a handful of plague-stricken natives who would have died anyways? Alex says, yes, the patients died anyway, being tainted with the plague. They were not eaten. Lavinia says, oh, Edward, I'm so sorry. What a feeble thing to say. But you know what I mean. The whole cannibalism thing was so rare, even outside of colonial influence, that can't help but think that there's racism going on here with why they said that. Lavinia says, oh, Edward, I'm so sorry. What a feeble thing to say. But you know what I mean. Edward says, and you know what I'm thinking. Peter says, I don't understand it all, but then I've been away for 2 years, and I don't know what happened to Celia during those 2 years. 2 years thinking about Celia. Edward says, it's the waste that I resent. Peter says, and you know more than I do. For me, it's everything else that's a waste. 2 years, and it was all a mistake. Julia, why don't you say anything? Julia says, you gave her those 2 years as best you could. Peter says, when did she take up this career? Julia says, 2 years ago. Peter says, 2 years ago, I tried to forget about her until I began to think myself a success, and I got a little more self-confidence, and then I thought about her again, more and more. At first, I did not want to know about Celia, and so I never asked. And then I wanted to know. I did not dare to ask. It took all my courage to ask you about her just now, but I never thought of anything like this. I suppose I didn't know her. I didn't understand her. I understand nothing, Riley says. You understand your métier, Mr. Quope, which is the most that any of us can ask for. And what a métier. I've tried to believe in it, so that I might believe in myself. I thought I had ideas to make a revolution in the cinema that no one could ignore, and here I am making a second-rate film. But I thought I was going to lead something better, and that seemed possible when Celia was alive. I wanted it, believed in it for Celia, and of course I wanted to do something for Celia. But what mattered was that Celia was alive, and now it's all worthless. Celia is not alive. Lavinia says, no, it's not all worthless, Peter. You've only just begun. I mean, this only brings you to the point at which you must begin. You were saying just now that you never knew Celia. We, none of us did. What you've been living on is an image of Celia, which you made for yourself to meet your own needs. Peter, please don't think I'm being unkind. Peter, no, I don't think you're being unkind, Lavinia. And I know that you're right, Lavinia says, and perhaps what I've been saying will seem less unkind if I can make you understand that, in fact, I've been talking about myself. And as I read this, I'm reminded of somebody that for 22 years, not 22 years, 12 years, didn't know them that long ago, 12 years ago, and on and off at least every year since. For you, I will, well, if you can't get your act together, or in one way, or by doing something or not doing something with your life, for yourself, for its own sake, whatever. And if they were completely out of your life, then still be good in achieving whatever abstaining or indulging of a particular matter is, it works in itself. Lavinia is right. This is where you start from. If you find out now, Peter, things about yourself that you don't like to face, well, just remember that some men have to learn much worse things about themselves and learn them later, when it's harder to recover and make a new beginning. It's not so hard for you. You're naturally good. Peter says, I'm sorry, I don't believe I've taken in all that you've been saying, but I'm grateful all the same. You know, all the time that you've been talking, one thought has been going around and around in my head, that I've only been interested in myself, and that isn't good enough for Celia. And when it's not for yourself, when it's not for itself, the doing and the not doing of things, worked out or just whatever, it waxes and wanes with various things. Julie says, you must have learned how to look at people, Peter, when you look at them with an eye for the films. That is, when you're not concerned with yourself, but just being an eye, you will come to think of Celia like that one day, and then you'll understand her and be reconciled and be happy in the thought of her. Lavinia says, Sir Henry, there's something I want to say to you. While Alex was telling us what had happened to Celia, I was looking at your face, and it seemed from your expression that the way in which she died did not disturb you, or the fact that she died because she would not leave a few dying natives. Raleigh says, who knows, Miss Chamberlain, the difference that it made to the natives who were dying, or the state of mind in which they died. Lavinia says, I'm willing to grant that. What struck me, though, was that your face showed no surprise or horror at the way in which she died. I don't know if you knew her. I suspect that you did. In any case, you knew about her. Yet I thought your expression was one of satisfaction. Raleigh says, Miss Chamberlain, I must be very transparent or else you are very perceptive. Lavinia says, oh, Henry, Lavinia is much more observant than you think. I believe that she has forced you to a showdown. Riley says, you state the position correctly, Julia. Do you mind if I quote poetry, Mrs. Chamberlain? And you can tell why one of them may not have to pay for a psychiatric stay and all this other stuff. I'm not sure comparatively what it is in modern in terms of when they're placing this play, but people dropping 20 grand or the equivalent of it 80 years ago or whatever it was, 100 years maybe. Lavinia says, "Oh no, I should love to hear you speaking poetry." Julie says, "She has made a point, Henry." Lavinia says, well, 80 years is probably closer. She's made a point, Henry. Lavinia says, "If it answers my question." Riley says, "Ere Babylon was dust, the Magus Zoroaster, my dead child, met his own image walking in the garden. At apparition, soul of men, he saw. For know, there are two worlds of life and death, one that which thou beholdest, but the other is underneath the grave, where do inhabit the shadows of all forms that think and live, till death unite them, and they part no more." Now, was he closer to around 1700 BCE, Zoroaster? Linguistically, that's a possibility. Of course, it's a possibility that 4,000 years ago language was being used at the time. There's also indication that it may have been before, so what the Parsis say about how old he was could be true. Certainly the revival movements of the Magians and the Achaemenids indicate that Zarathustra was likely not of those times, but some individual before. Much like Abraham is amongst the most of the people who claim Abraham as supporting their lineage. The Christians and the Jews, of course. And Riley keeps saying, "When I first met Mrs. Copplestone in this room, I saw the image standing behind her chair of Celia Copplestone, whose face showed the astonishment of the first 5 minutes after a violent death. At this strange or credulity, Miss Chamberlain, I ask you only to entertain the suggestion that a sudden intuition in certain minds may tend to express itself at once in a picture. That happens to me sometimes. So it was obvious that there was a woman under sentence of death. That was her destiny. The only question then was, what sort of death? I could not know, because it was for her to choose the way of life, to lead to death, and without knowing the end, yet choose the form of death. We know the death she chose. I did not know that she would die in this way. She did not know. So all that I could do was to direct her in the way of preparation. That way which she accepted led to this death. And if that is not a happy death, what death is happy?" Edward says, "Do you mean that having chosen this form of death, she did not suffer as ordinary people suffer?" Riley says, "Not at all what I mean. Rather the contrary. I say that she suffered all that we should suffer, in fear and pain and loathing, all these together, and reluctance of the body to become a thing. I'd say she suffered more, because more conscious than the rest of us, she paid the highest price in suffering. That is part of the design." Lavinia says, "Perhaps she'd been through greater agony beforehand. I know nothing of her last 2 years." Well, he says, "That shows some insight on your part, Miss Chamberlain. But such experience can only be hinted at in myths and images." Now, myths sometimes are not literal, but sometimes they can be literal. But myths, there's this mythology is an ideology. There's a spiritual connection to it, a connection of meaning. To speak about it, we talk of darkness, labyrinths, minotaur terrors, but that world does not take place of this one. Do you imagine that the saint in the desert, with spiritual evil always at his shoulder, suffered any less from hunger, damp exposure, bowel trouble, and the fear of lions? Well, based on some of the stories, probably more from the last two at least. Cold of the night and heat of the day, then we should. Edward says, "But if this was right for Celia, There must be something else that is terribly wrong, and the rest of us are somehow involved in the wrong. I shall only speak for myself. I'm sure that I am. Riley says, let me free your mind from one impediment. You must try to detach yourself from what you still feel as your responsibility. Edward says, I cannot help the feeling that in some way my responsibility is greater than that of a band of half-crazed savages. And what, supporting colonial wars is, or that sort of thing is not savage and crazy? Lavinia says, oh, Edward, I knew what you were thinking. Doesn't it help you that I feel guilty too? Riley says, if we all were judged according to the consequences of our words and deeds beyond intention and beyond our limited understanding of ourselves and others, we should all be condemned. Miss Chamberlain, I often have to make a decision which may mean restoration or ruin to a patient, and sometimes I've made the wrong decision. As for Miss Copplestone, because you think her death was a waste, you blame yourselves. And because you blame yourselves, you think her life was wasted. It was triumphant, but I am no more responsible for the triumph, and just as responsible for her death as you are. Lavinia says, yet I know I shall go on blaming myself for being so unkind to her, so spiteful. I shall go on seeing her at the moment when she said goodbye to us 2 years ago. Edward says, your responsibility is nothing to mine, Lavinia. Lavinia says, I'm not sure about that. If I had understood you, then I might not have misunderstood Celia. And, not gotten into the affair, right? Riley says, you will have to live with these memories and make them into something new. Only by acceptance of the past will you alter its meaning. Julie says, Henry, I think it is time that I said something. Everyone makes a choice, of one kind or another, and then must take the consequences. Celia chose a way of which the consequence was Kincunja. Peter chose a way that leads him to Boltwell, and he's got to go there. Peter says, I see what you mean. I wish I didn't have to, but the car will be waiting, and the experts. I'd almost forgotten them. I realize that I can't get out of it. And what else can I do? Alex says, it is your film, and I know that Bella expects great things of it. Peter says, so now I'll be going. Edward says, shall we see you again, Peter, before you leave England? Lavinia says, do try to come to see us. I think it would do us all good, you and me and Edward, to talk about Celia. Peter says, thanks very much, but not this time. I simply shan't be able to. Edward says, but on your next visit? Peter says, the next time I come to England, I promise you, I really do want to see you both very much. Julie, goodbye, Julia. Goodbye, Alex. Goodbye, Sir Henry. And exits. Julie says, and now the consequence of the Chamberlain's choice is a cocktail party. They must be ready for it. Their guests may be arriving at any moment. Raleigh says, Julia, you are right. It is also right that the Chamberlains should now be giving a party. Lavinia says, and I have been thinking for the last 5 minutes. How could I face my guests? I wish it was over. I mean, I'm glad you came. I'm glad Alex told us. And Peter had to know. Edward says, now I think I understand. Then I hope you will explain it to me, Lavinia says. Edward says, it isn't much that I understand yet, but Sir Henry has been saying. I think that every moment is a fresh beginning, and Julia, that life is only keeping on. And somehow, the two ideas seem to fit together, Lavinia says. But all the same, I don't want to see these people. Riley says, it is your appointed burden. As for the party, I'm sure that it will be a success. And I think, Henry, that we should leave before the party begins. They will get on better without us. You too, Alex. Lavinia says, we don't want you to go. Alex says, we've had another engagement. Raleigh says, and on this occasion I shall not be unexpected. Julie says, now Henry, now Alex, we're going to the Cunnings. Julia, Riley, and Alex exit. Lavinia says, Edward, how am I looking? Edward says, very well. I might almost say your best. But you always look your best. Lavinia says, oh, Edward, that spoils it. No woman can believe that she always looks her best. You're rather transparent, when you're trying to cheer me up. To say, I always look my best, can only mean the worst. Well, if you don't want to admit that you look, different than, when you were, younger or whatever. Edward says, I shall never learn how to pay a compliment. Lavinia says, what you should have done was to admire my dress. Edward says, but I've already told you how much I like it. Lavinia says, but so much has happened since then, and besides, one sometimes likes to hear the same compliment twice. Edward says, and now for the party. Lavinia says, and now for the party. Edward says, it will soon be over. Lavinia says, I wish it would have begun. Edward says, there's the doorbell. Lavinia says, oh, I'm glad it's begun. And then there's the curtain, and the One-Eyed Riley, as scored from the author's dictation by Miss Mary Trevelyan. I'm going to try this. As I was walking round and round in every quarter, I walked into a public house, ordered up my gin and water, to-ree-oo-lee, to-ree-ee-la. What's the matter with One-Eyed Riley? As I was drinking gin and water, and being the One-Eyed Riley, who came in but the landlord's daughter, and she took my heart entirely. To-ree-oo-lay, to-ree-lay. What's the matter with One-Eyed Riley? And the cast of the first production at the Edinburgh Festival: Robert Fleming, Kathleen Nesbitt, Irene Worth, Ernest Clark, Donald Houston, Alec Guinness, Ursula Jeans, Christina Horniman, Donald Bain, Martin Beckwith, Edward, Julia, Celia, Alexander, Peter, the identified guest, Lavinia Chamberlain, and her secretary, 2 caterers, men.